his presentation, for his discussant remarks. Then we open it to the floor. Nigel, the floor is yours.
Let me thank you very much for inviting me and say I hate PowerPoints. It is a crucifixion, PowerPoints. I have to read the damn text of whatever stupid thing I said months ago when I wrote it, instead of talking, which is what I prefer to do, in the belief that lecturing is a branch of the dramatic industry and needs dramatization. But if you have PowerPoints, you can't. So let me start by saying I became interested in why people migrate between countries in the 80s. And in the period since then and now, not only has the issue come high on the agenda of policy issues in all the developed countries, but also it shifted. And it's that shift that I want to suggest to you. When it started, there were the beginnings of, and in subsequent years, many more, an immense wealth of studies, economic and econometric, trying to identify the impact of immigration on particular countries, especially in the United States. The literature is large and rich and concerns this issue of the social and economic impact. It is only recently that I think we've begun to realize it's the politics of migration which are decisive, not the economic and social impact. So I want to explore that theme. That's pretty good, isn't it? The theme, then, is a contradiction between the immobile state, bounded and territorial, and a mobile global economy. And that's the conjuncture we're looking at with migration, between the requirements of national political control and the requirements of economic growth and development. And to put it in a very simple form, between politics and economics, between the market and the state. And it's that central contradiction. We're in a period of transition now, I believe, to a single global economy, which is undermining the state and causing a considerable crisis of conception, of approach, as much as the reality of it. So now, going into this, or the three components I want to talk about are, first of all, the less explored history of the control of internal migration, where the ethics of political power overwhelmingly dominate, and the needs of economic development in the first section. The second on international migration, and then the third on what is called integration. So, internal migration. Oh, that's very good. My nephew, who is 16, did this for me, showing I'm just illustrating my complete ignorance of the technology. A central preoccupation, historically, of the state is with the control of the population, identifying it and controlling it. And with the rise of the modern national state and the drawing of boundaries, this becomes more and more important. This is to prevent or regulate mobility in order for the state to keep track of its population. This effort is limited, in the past has been limited, only by the administrative capacity of the state and its other preoccupations. But we can see over and over again, every time any form of economic development begins to take place, the state has a crisis in trying to track its population, in trying to nail it down, as it were, and prevent it responding to the changing territorial economy. And that contradiction occurs over and over again. Tsarist Russia, notorious for its internal controls, for the pass system that was operated under the Tsars, etc., in preventing people moving about, a tradition which was inherited by the Soviet regime. Frederick's Prussia is another example of the tight control of all the population. You can see there the connection between the control of the population and the army, i.e. the population provide the soldiers. You have to nail the soldiers down in order to make them fight. Making them fight was always very difficult, but identifying them was even more important. So preventing them migrating was a key element. And the Tsarist regime, you remember, arises because the Cossacks, because of land was apparently unlimited in Tsarist Russia, so the peasants could run away. When they were fed up with being robbed by the nobility and the Tsar, they ran away and they produced the Cossacks. And that robbed the Tsarist armies of its manpower. So in one sense, the whole machinery of control of mobility follows from the attempt to secure the army. And finally, Tokugawa, Japan. Something quite out of the Japanese cultural tradition, but almost identical in terms of internal passes, in terms of checkpoints, etc., etc. More generally, we can see the elements of this tying the population to the soil as embodied in feudalism and serfdom. Under serfdom, the serf was tied to the soil, so there could be no question of mobility, and the punishments for those that dared to move were ferocious. I mentioned here that in Elizabethan England, when people tried to move between parishes, the first penalty was to remove an ear, then a hand, then the nose, etc., slowly reducing the person, as it were, in punishing them because they dared to travel between parishes. The trouble is that I can't remember to do this. There you are, you see. You'll have to catch up. Okay. The former Soviet Union is an interesting example of this attempt to tie down the population. And indeed they had, in quotes, remarkable, in quotes, success in doing so. The population of Prague, for example, if you look over the 30 or 40 years, hardly changed at all. That is to say, the tracking of the population prevented urbanization. And that becomes now a modern preoccupation, how to prevent urbanization by tying the population to their place of origin. And the Eastern Bloc countries generally. I put in there a little anecdote. When Yeltsin was the mayor of Moscow, he could not get Moscow cleaned. The Muscovites would not clean the city. So he was obliged to go to the countryside and import labor who didn't have urban status to clean Moscow. And then they ran away. I mention it because it shows you the illegal immigrant is an internal phenomenon before it is an external phenomenon, and shows the same thing. The labor force won't do the dirty jobs, and you have to bring them from somewhere else. The remnant is the Russian registration system, Propiska, and the identity card, I have to say, which is the same point of nailing people to a place. The Propiska gives right to amazing misjudgments of human rights. That is to say, a child, there was a television program not long ago on Al Jazeera about those children whose parents by chance lost their Propiska. They become non-persons. They cannot apply for any of the benefits, they cannot go to school, etc., and they can't get it replaced. It is an absolutely monstrous form of control, the identity card. In a number of newly independent countries, in the 60s and 70s, there was also an attempt to control the population in order to move it about. This was in the heyday of planning, in which planners were under the illusion that they knew better than everybody else where people should be, and that people should be moved by force. And I mentioned a number of cases there. Migrasi in Indonesia, which must be familiar with you, Malaysia, the Philippines, Tanzania, Ujama, etc. That is to say, the planners dictated where the population ought to be in the light of the interest of the state rather than people responding to economic incentives. Finally, I leave. Do I? No, I don't. I'm forgetting to do this. You'll have to shout at me to get me to move on, because otherwise I'm just going to forget. 2